There is a movie that should not exist, not because it was a bad idea, but because everything that could go wrong during its production did go wrong. The director had never made a film before. The script was rewritten daily, sometimes hourly, half the cast was improvising, the other half was barely showing up, and the single most beloved scene in the entire movie, the one that audiences have quoted for 45 years, was filmed completely alone, with no other actors present at the very last minute almost as an afterthought. That movie is Caddyshack, and what you think you know about it is only the beginning. Close your eyes for just a moment. Think back to 1980. The summer was long and hot. The radio was playing something you still remember every word to. And somewhere in a movie theater near you, a film was unspooling that nobody had predicted, nobody had planned, and almost nobody in Hollywood had taken seriously. It made you laugh until your sides ached. It gave you lines you still use today. And it introduced you to a cast of comic performers operating at a level of anarchic brilliance that the film industry has never quite managed to replicate. But behind every frame of that movie was a story of beautiful, magnificent chaos. It begins as so many great Hollywood stories do, with friendship and ambition colliding in a small room. Harold Ramis, Douglas Kenney, and Brian Doyle Murray sat down together to write a script rooted in something deeply personal. Doyle Murray had spent his teenage summers caddying at a golf club in Illinois, carrying bags for wealthy men who rarely learned his name. Those summers had left him with an inventory of observations about class, privilege, and the precise way that money insulates certain people from ever having to confront their own mediocrity. Kenney, who had co-founded the National Lampoon and was one of the sharpest comic minds of his generation, recognized immediately that this material was gold. Ramis, whose instincts for structure and character were already legendary among his peers, understood how to build a world around it. What they wrote was, at its core, a story about a young caddy navigating the social hierarchy of a fictional country club called Bushwood, a coming-of-age story with teeth, a class comedy with genuine anger underneath the laughter. But then the casting began, and Caddyshack stopped being the movie they had written and became something else entirely, something wilder, something that followed its own gravitational rules. Chevy Chase was at the absolute peak of his cultural moment in 1980. He had left Saturday Night Live after just one season, turned down enormous offers to return, and was already being spoken of in certain Hollywood circles as the next major film comedy star. When he agreed to play Ty Webb, the effortlessly cool, philosophically detached golf who floats through Bushwood like a Zen master on a perpetual vacation, the production gained an immediate credibility it might not otherwise have had. Bill Murray was a different proposition entirely. Murray's character, Carl Spackler, the deranged, mumbling, eerily philosophical groundskeeper waging a private war against a gopher, was not originally intended to be a significant part of the film. He was a supporting player, background texture, comic relief between the more structured scenes involving the main cast. Nobody told Bill Murray that. Murray arrived on set in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where the film was shot at the Grande Oaks Golf Club, with his own complete internal universe for Carl already constructed. He improvised relentlessly. He disappeared into character between takes in ways that confused and occasionally alarmed the crew. And in a film already operating without a firm center of gravity, Murray became a kind of comic black hole, pulling every scene he entered into his own orbit. But here is the fact that reframes everything you've ever seen in Caddyshack. The entire film was shot in 29 days. For a production involving multiple major comedy stars, elaborate physical gags, outdoor locations subject to the unpredictable weather of South Florida, a cast that included a live gopher and a director making his feature film debut. 29 days to capture what would become one of the most quoted comedies in American film history. To put that in perspective, most current television drama series take longer to film a single episode. That compressed timeline was not a creative choice, it was a financial necessity. The budget was tight, the studio's confidence was limited, and the pressure to deliver something, anything, on schedule was constant. What it produced, paradoxically, was a kind of creative freedom that more time and more money might have actually destroyed. There was no opportunity for second-guessing. No room for the paralysis that sometimes accompanies careful, deliberate filmmaking. Every day on set had to count. Every improvised moment that landed had to be kept because there was no time to search for something better. And the gopher. Nobody ever properly explains the gopher. That animatronic creature, lurching across the fairways of Bushwood with an expression of demented satisfaction, was not in the original script. It was added during production when someone realized the film needed a visual mascot, a recurring comic anchor that could punctuate the chaos with something purely absurdly physical. The puppet cost more than several actors' weekly salaries. It became the symbol of the entire film, and they almost cut it entirely before release. What happened next on that Florida golf course is the kind of story that gets passed around Hollywood for decades, growing slightly larger with each retelling, but never losing its essential truth. Harold Ramis was 32 years old when he stepped behind the camera to direct Caddyshack. He had written brilliantly. He had collaborated on some of the sharpest comedy of his generation, but directing a feature film is a fundamentally different discipline, and Ramis has arrived on set knowing that the distance between writing a scene and actually capturing it on film is wider than it appears from the outside. What saved him in those first chaotic days of production was something no film school could have taught him. He trusted his cast completely. Not blindly, he had strong instincts about what was working and what wasn't, But he understood that the performers standing in front of his camera were operating at a level of comic intelligence that rigid direction would only diminish. His greatest skill as a first-time director turned out to be knowing precisely when to get out of the way. And nobody required more creative space than Chevy Chase and Bill Murray. Here is a fact that genuinely surprises people when they first encounter it. Chevy Chase and Bill Murray, despite sharing the screen in one of the most celebrated comedy films of their era, filmed almost none of their scenes together. Their schedules barely overlapped during the 29-day shoot. The famous scene in which Ty Webb and Carl Spackler share a late-night conversation in Carl's underground apartment, passing a joint, drifting through philosophical territory that somehow manages to be simultaneously profound and completely absurd, was filmed in a single afternoon. The two men had perhaps 40 minutes of preparation before the cameras rolled. What ended up on screen was almost entirely improvised. Two of the sharpest comedic minds of their generation left alone in a room together with a loose concept and a running camera, producing something that audiences 45 years later still stop to watch whenever it appears on television. That scene exists because Harold Ramis understood that some things cannot be written, they can only be discovered. But the story of what was happening off-camera during the production of Caddyshack is in some ways more dramatic than anything that made it into the final cut. Douglas Kenney was not well. Kenney had co-founded the National Lampoon at 23, had co-written Animal House, and had arrived at Caddyshack carrying the particular weight that comes with having already achieved more than most people manage in an entire career. He was funny in the way that only genuinely troubled people can be, with a precision and a darkness underneath the laughter that his closest friends found both brilliant and alarming. On the set of Caddyshack, Kenney was visibly struggling. He had a small acting role in the film. He plays the laconic Stoner Spaulding, a background presence in several scenes, but his real function during production was as a creative presence, a sounding board, a spiritual co-author whose instincts Ramis and Doyle Murray trusted absolutely. When a scene wasn't landing, Kenney was the one they turned to. When an improvised moment needed shaping, his instincts were the compass. But the pressure, combined with personal difficulties that those closest to him were only beginning to understand the full depth of, was taking a visible toll. People on set remember him as intermittently brilliant and increasingly unreachable. A man who could walk into a room and illuminate it completely and then disappear into himself in ways that left his friends quietly frightened. Less than 3 months after Caddyshack was released, Douglas Kenney died in Hawaii under circumstances that were officially ruled accidental. He was 33 years old. Chevy Chase, who was among his closest friends, later said up something about Kenney that has stayed with everyone who heard it, that Doug was the funniest person he had ever known, and that the laughter was always covering something that never quite got the chance to heal. Caddyshack carries that shadow, even if most audiences watch it without ever knowing it's there. Now let's talk about Rodney Dangerfield, because his story in this film is one of the most extraordinary examples of late career reinvention in Hollywood history. Dangerfield was 58 years old when he was cast as Altrovik, the loud, irreverent, magnificently tasteless nouveau riche golfer who arrives at Bushwood and immediately begins dismantling everything the club's establishment holds sacred. He had spent decades in the comedy trenches, working clubs, perfecting his timing, building the self-deprecating persona that would eventually make him famous. But in 1980, film stardom was still genuinely new territory for him. He approached the role with the hunger of someone who understood at 58 that certain opportunities do not come twice. Almost every line Dangerfield delivers in Caddyshack is a variation on material he had been developing in his stand-up act for years. The production gave him unusual freedom to reshape his dialogue, to adjust timing, to find the precise rhythm that worked for him rather than forcing him into a pre-written mold. What emerged was not quite acting in the traditional sense. It was something closer to a live performance captured on film, Rodney Dangerfield being more completely himself than the medium of cinema typically allows. The result was a character so fully realized, so kinetically alive in every frame, that audiences who had never seen Dangerfield perform stand-up walked out of cinemas in 1980 feeling they had discovered something entirely new. They just didn't know it had taken him 30 years to build. And then there is the matter of the pool scene. The one that made studio executives physically uncomfortable when they first watched the dailies. The one that Ramis defended with a specificity and a clarity that eventually won the argument. The one that said something true and uncomfortable about class and exclusion that no amount of polish or studio notes could quite scrub away. Caddyshack was always funnier than it appeared, and always angrier than anyone admitted. There is a moment in the editing room where a film either finds itself or loses itself forever. For Caddyshack, that moment lasted several weeks and nearly destroyed everything the cast and crew had built on that Florida golf course. The first cut of the film ran significantly longer than the version audiences eventually saw. It had a more coherent narrative spine, the coming-of-age story of Danny Noonan, the young caddy it had structure, it had emotional progression, it had everything a well-made comedy was supposed to have, and it was considerably less funny than what ended up in theaters. The editing process on Caddyshack was, by every account from those who lived through it, an exercise in painful clarity. Scene after carefully constructed scene was removed. The narrative architecture that Ramis, Kenney, and Doyle Murray had spent months building was systematically dismantled in favor of something looser, faster, and more instinctively alive. Michael O'Keefe, who played Danny Noonan with genuine skill and commitment, watched his character's story arc shrink with each successive cut until what remained was a thread rather than a spine. It was the right decision, and it was an agonizing one. What the editors discovered sitting in that room with miles of footage from 29 days of controlled chaos was that the heart of Caddyshack was not its plot, it was its moments. The film lived and breathed in the spaces between the story, in an improvised line that landed with perfect unexpected weight, in a physical gag that defied logic but satisfied something deeper than logic, in the anarchic energy of performers who had been given just enough freedom to surprise even themselves. The finished film that audiences saw in July of 1980 was, in the most literal sense, assembled from the best moments of a movie that no longer existed in its original form. And the studio was not convinced it had anything. Warner Brothers released Caddyshack with modest expectations and a marketing campaign that emphasized the star power of Chase and Dangerfield without quite knowing how to explain what kind of film it actually was. The early critical response was genuinely mixed. Several respected reviewers found it undisciplined, episodic, and structurally incoherent. Criticisms that were, objectively speaking, not entirely wrong. But audiences in the summer of 1980 did not want coherent structure. They wanted to laugh with the specific abandon that only comes when a film stops trying to control you and simply invites you to surrender to it. They wanted Rodney Dangerfield delivering perfectly timed chaos in a canary yellow golf outfit. They wanted Bill Murray conducting a one-man war against a gopher with the focused intensity of a man who has found his true calling. They wanted Chevy Chase moving through the world as though gravity were merely a suggestion. Caddyshack earned $39 million at the domestic box office against a production budget of approximately $6 million. By any measure, that is an extraordinary return. But the numbers alone don't capture what actually happened in those theaters in the summer of 1980. What happened was that a film found its audience with a precision that no marketing campaign could have engineered, because the audience recognized something in Caddyshack that went beyond comedy. They recognized permission. Permission to find the pretension of established institutions genuinely, magnificently ridiculous. Permission to side with the groundskeeper over the Board of Governors. Permission to laugh at the architecture of privilege from the inside and from the outside simultaneously. Caddyshack understood something about America in 1980 that most films that year were too cautious to say directly. Now consider what the film left behind, because the legacy of Caddyshack operates on several levels that rarely get discussed together. The most obvious legacy is linguistic. There are lines from this film that have achieved a kind of immortality that the writers themselves could not have predicted. Phrases that appear in speeches and articles and conversations between people who may not even remember where they first heard them. The vocabulary of Caddyshack has been absorbed so completely into the fabric of American comic language that it functions now as a kind of shared cultural shorthand, a way of signaling between two people that they belong to the same generation, that they remember the same summers, that they carry the same particular species of humor in their bones. But the deeper legacy is the one that runs through the careers of everyone involved. Harold Ramis went on to write and direct some of the most beloved comedies of the following 2 decades: Ghostbusters, National Lampoon's Vacation, Groundhog Day. Each of those films carries within it the lesson that Caddyshack taught him, that the most memorable comedy comes not from controlling every variable, but from creating the conditions in which something genuinely unexpected can occur, and then having the courage to keep it. Bill Murray became, over the 45 years following Caddyshack, something that very few entertainers ever achieve: a genuine cultural institution. A figure whose presence in a film or a photograph or an unexpected real-life encounter carries an almost mythological weight. The seeds of that mythology were planted in Carl Spackler's underground lair in 29 Days of Florida Heat, in a performance that nobody fully planned and nobody could have fully predicted. And then there is the Dalai Lama speech. If you have seen Caddyshack, you know the one. Murray's Carl Spackler describing with the luminous conviction of a true believer how he once caddied for the Dalai Lama and received, in lieu of payment, a promise of total consciousness on his deathbed. It is one of the most purely invented, completely unscripted, gloriously pointless pieces of comic monologue in the history of American film. Murray wrote it himself, the night before filming, alone. It took one take. Douglas Kenney never saw what Caddyshack became. He never saw the lines become legend, never watched the film find its permanent place in the American comic canon, never heard his words quoted back at him by strangers in airports and golf courses and living rooms across the country. He was gone before any of that happened, but he was there when it was made. He was there in the heat and the chaos and the 29 impossible days when a group of extraordinarily talented people made something that should not have worked, and made it work so completely that half a century later, it still makes people stop what they are doing and laugh. That is the untold story of Caddyshack. Not the gopher, not the pool, not the judge smashing his clubs on the 18th hole. The untold story is the one about the people who showed up with almost nothing. No time, no certainty, no guarantee that any of it would land, and built something that outlasted all of them. That is what great comedy does when it gets lucky enough to find the right people in the right room at exactly the right moment. It lasts.